So let's start with what you guys understand of ethograms and ethnographies.
Yeah, so I think with Ethogram again, I think it's cataloging common behaviors across a certain species. With ethnography, it is more about describing a species with their cultures and customs and but again, I don't know whether this is a I don't know whether ethnographies have a I guess they take on also a little bit more of a qualitative approach because it's a description. So I would imagine that it's a little bit more comprehensive versus just listing down, behaviors across species.
Yeah.
I think that's my
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
Ethnographies, I'm hearing the word for the first time, but they kind of like remind me of like ethnicities. So I'm wondering if it's something along those
Yeah.
lines. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's excellent, right? Like that's where you should be going. So ethnicity is one way, and the other is biographies. So now you can start seeing that it's somewhere in between. So biographies usually tend to be of an individual, whereas an ethnography is going to be of a collective. This kind of inclusion of more actors and the environment and things like that. So ethograms, I think, are more prevalent in animal behavior science, and specifically the use of the word science there, which is it's empirical, it's numbers based, it's evidence based. And ethnography, on the other hand, has to do with telling of stories, stories of collectives, stories with, how many perspectives that you bring in. It's more of a term that you're likely to see in sociology and anthropology and things like that. So I think into the animal world, animal biographies and animal ethnographies are something that is now beginning to see an increase with fields like, of course, what I'm studying in college, which is anthrozoology, but also critical animal studies, human animal studies. Typically, ethograms are presented as activity budgets. That's kind of the most common format that I have seen of ethograms of a lot of animals. And this is very effectively used, for instance, to point out that there's a welfare issue with animals in captivity. Why we need to do it this way? That's a whole other thing, but we need to see numbers, right? It's not enough to see an animal suffering. So then when you create an activity budget of an animal in captivity, saying, look at how long the animal is spending in, for instance, stereotypies. And I think when we're looking at kind of those big picture things, right? Like to make an argument that all animals in zoos are their welfare is compromised, or rather, most animals is compromised. And to compare their behavior to all others of the species. So this is the common denominator. And look, they're not near the common denominator, right? That kind of a show of that those type of arguments really benefit from ethograms.
And I say we as just also students of Barks, right? I
Yeah.
think where we've extensively used it is to change the definition of what problem behaviors are, right? So we've said, for example, chewing, sniffing, scavenging, barking, right? All of these are part of a dog's ethogram, which means that they're natural behaviors, they're not problem behaviors. And I think that's definitely been like a big leverage in conversation and just shifting perspective.
You're absolutely right in that numbers do have certain authority, but authority also means there's a pushback. And authority also, I mean, people don't like it when you come at them with certain amount of data. And what we typically do is go back with more data, right? You say, hey, street dogs are not like pet dogs. Oh, really? Let me show it to you. Let me get you DNA evidence. Let me get you, something else, more evidence. And it's really a power struggle. Many of us who have gotten used to relying on the idea of science have also been enamored by this concept that it is highly objective, right? So you go in there and say, it's not your opinion or my opinion, it's science, it's fact. But I think what Ahana brought up is an interesting one, because what is surfacing to me more and more, what I'm beginning to realize more and more, particularly when I see animal behavior science, is it's not as objective as we think it is. There is subjectivity, and a huge part of it is the subjectivity of it is something that we're presenting as, hey, it's objective fact. And I think there is a problem, right? We are not acknowledging the fact that, yes, we chose to ask very specific set of questions. We chose to uncover very specific, information, because we come from a certain place. We come from a certain bias, but we're not using that. Instead, we are now, presenting this as hardcore fact. And I think that is problematic. So I think ethograms do have a place, but ethograms also have a problem. Scientific, number-based, empirical thing still wins the day when it comes to policy. If we are, for instance, going to a shelter to say that, hey, there's a problem with welfare of the animals with the way they're being kept, and if you make XYZ change, you will see significant difference. Numbers speak louder than anything else, even to this day. Even with numbers, it's going to be hard, but without numbers, I don't see how it can happen. And it's a very interesting train of thought, because this whole thing, right, when you said, if I say my dog does this and I present an observation and people come back with, oh, but, and you say, oh, I present numbers.
Yeah.
What you're actually saying is, I shut them up at that point, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to say, is that you can do with numbers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? You can actually say, okay, time out. This is the end of the conversation. Look, there's data.
Yeah.
Right? So you can say, but here's data.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I mean by authority, because if you didn't have that data, that would be a long conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's the thing, right? Does data have the authority that it tries to assert?
Yeah.
Data tries to assert authority. Right? That's what data does. It goes in with this, I am right. Maybe that attitude is the problem. Right? Especially when we are presenting things that are so edgy. I don't know if, and given today's climate that we are in, I think that is the problem with science. The problem with science is it tries to masquerade as an objective thing. It tries to then claim authority, while it actually isn't. And I think that is problematic with science. But like you said, I think there are still large parts of the world where science is the only language they speak. You cannot possibly go into, say, like I mentioned, like policy, right? Let's say rabies eradication kind of a thing. You cannot go in there you cannot dream to get in through, get a seat at the table without having data. I don't dismiss it off as unnecessary, right? It's not unnecessary. It's not incorrect. I think there is value in it. There is huge value in it. But there are problems, I think, with the way data is presented, the way people deal with data. I think they come in, people who are armed with numbers, I shouldn't say data, numbers really, and graphs, I think come in hoping to gain a sense of authority. And that may be an abuse of those numbers.
Like, you come to, let's say, a culture that you don't know, and you observe that culture, it's very easy to use numbers and present it in a totally wrong way, like to represent the whole culture in a wrong way. So
when we talk about the desire of numbers to claim authority, this is really interesting. So white male voices tend to have an extraordinary authority. People with large followers bring in authority. Large number of people, there's again power in numbers. So it is a power game. It's really, we think that data is so objective, but really it seems to be a popularity contest. Right? Yeah. That's kind of what it boils down to. Whose numbers are the ones that are trending now?
Yeah.
That is the sticking point for me with numbers, is that it really is a popularity context, but it pretends to be highly objective. And everybody who uses it pretends that it's highly objective. Ethnographies are qualitative studies. They don't bring in numbers. They don't bring in authority. They bring in stories. And stories have the ability, let's talk about the pros first, because I think cons already, in the back of our mind, we know it. We've kind of discussed it, which is there's no authority, right? Who the hell is going to care about a story, right? But let's park that for a little bit and look at what actually stories can do. Stories can go where numbers can't. When I talk about street dogs, when I talk about, what they can do and what they're capable of doing, the comeback at me often is, oh, but can all dogs do it? Can, this dog do it? And can, in all situations, and blah, 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 blah. And if I try to answer those, I get very, very stuck because I'm answering the wrong question, right? Whereas with human beings, what are human achievements? Humans have gone to the moon. All of us haven't. Just a bunch of, barely, you can count on two hands. But humans, 8 billion humans can go to the moon. We can paint the Sistine Chapel, right? We can invent rockets and so on and so forth. Communication, I think, is one of the most nuanced behaviors social beings have, right? And to try to go there with numbers was a project that was DOA, dead on arrival, right? I was never going to land with that. Because you roll back, observations are great. You have these observations, but roll back. How do you know these are signals? How do you know there's communication going on? Okay, how do I know this is a signal? Signals are based on, the sender sends something, the receiver receives something, and, what has been sent from this side, what has been received from that side, they both have to match, and, both of them confirm. Then, there's a signal that has been sent. Otherwise, you can always, and science stacks you up against this. We were talking about this in the morning as well, Occam's razor and Morgan's cannon, which is you have to take the simplest explanation possible. So it's very difficult to argue that this is not sheer coincidence. Right? This, the human did this and the dog gave this signal. To say it's not sheer coincidence, I have to show it to you in numbers, as in large numbers. But what we're saying about communication is it's highly nuanced, it's personalized. So will two dogs give you the same response in the same situation? Very unlikely, right? And I plunged into the stories because really that's where I could tell what I saw, right? So I think it can be extremely powerful. But two problems. One is it doesn't have authority and it's not objective, right? So I think the two problems get addressed in very interesting ways. But before I do, I want to tell you guys something that my professor said. And I asked exactly this, right? I said, I'm a nobody, in the field right now. And if I come and say, I saw this, who's going to care? But I think what's interesting is stories don't need authority, don't try to gain authority. They try to engage. So when you're trying to engage, it's the interestingness that matters, not the authority that matters. And what he told me, which was really interesting, is he said, it's a high-risk game you're playing here. But what you're saying is the story I have here is worth telling because there's a very interesting takeaway from here. Good ethnographies, what they do is they don't pretend to be objective. They say, hey, I'm not. I'm telling you where I'm coming from. And this is the story I'm saying. So you sit here and listen to my story if you're okay with where I'm coming from. You want to hear an Indian person's opinion on a street dog? You sit here and listen to my story. An Indian person who likes street dogs, who cares for street dogs, and here is why. I'm telling you why I'm doing it. You want to hear it? You want to engage with me? You can sit here. I'm not pretending, to be somebody else who's presenting objective facts. I don't have to mask the color of my skin. I don't have to take away my accent. I bring it all with me and I put it on the table and says, do you still want to engage with me? Because they don't give you the authority to do this kind of mic drop and walk. They don't, right? you have to tell your story and people will be like, but, and you have to sit and engage with all of them. You have to bring the depth of understanding of the story, a deep understanding of your story. And so ethnographies are not just folk tales. They're not tales that, you just observe them, you saw something and you go and write something. No, it's not that, right? You bringing in a depth of understanding. You create what are called thick descriptions, like a biography. You bring in that kind of heavy information and you put it out. And they've made a huge difference to at least some octopus. A difference that they probably would not have been able to make if they were trying to get numbers to demonstrate that octopi are smart. But making a movie following this one particular octopus who's, bonding with this person, recognizing this person, being extremely intelligent, holding a shell on his head and running like that, and, engaging in play, engaging in mirth, and for people to look past that as an edible thing to looking at the individual was a masterpiece in storytelling. And that depth, right, and this extraordinary reflexivity in it. And that's also what I mean by reflexivity, is not just telling where you come from, but asking yourself all the questions. You have to trust the people you give the stories to, and they have to arrive at the answers themselves. So you are kind of shining a light on this, saying this and this combined is what, and you're kind of allowing them to arrive at that. I think that can be very, very powerful because, it gives them the room. You're not seeking authority at all, but they can create great room for collaboration, great room for, opening. And I found that when I've changed the way I talk, I get far more people inviting me to talk and inviting me to conversations. People who don't agree with me are still okay with inviting me to. Don't get upset if your stories trigger people. That doesn't mean your stories aren't landing. It means they're landing. And how? And I feel like they can, and stories trigger people even more than numbers do. Numbers they dismiss off, but stories are hard to dismiss. So I wrote a paper recently where I said, and I think this was about myotherapy, where I said, I can't wait for science. So I need to go where stories lead me because they're at the cutting edge of where it is. Numbers will take a few decades to catch up with me. There's a reason why we are where we are, right? We have to move forward and faster. Let the slower guys come back and prove me right or wrong. But I want to tell my radical story now. And I don't care if it ruffles your feathers the wrong way. It means my story is landing, but the numbers can come and catch up. So an interesting counter argument to stories, right, is everybody can come with their own stories and their own versions, right? So somebody can come. I mean, I've seen people, trainers, who observe the same set of street dogs and will come back and say, there's a hierarchy, there is an alpha, there's a pack leader, so on and so forth. That's the way he tells his story. And I think the big place where these guys make a mistake, and this is something we need to learn how to catch, is they bring stories, but they try to claim authority like with numbers. Passing on of knowledge through stories is something that has happened in many, many, many cultures. Using science to capture and transmit knowledge is a very Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, Europe, North America kind of a culture, which of course now is most part of the world follows it. So that storytelling component is getting lost. But it was a huge part of knowledge creation and knowledge transmission. And not irrelevant knowledge. This extraordinary knowledge that was generated and transmitted through stories. And stories, because they don't claim authority, you don't have somebody claiming IP on them, right? There's not somebody getting a patent on these stories. They just become part of the fabric. So which means that when you tell a story, you have to have courage that it won't be yours anymore. It slips out of your fingers. It goes away. Others take it and run with it. They'll make it their own. So it requires a kind of a very collaborative frame of mind, where you say that it's really about the knowledge or about the dog or about whatever it is, something other than yourself, and it's not your discovery.
This is absolutely so overwhelming and thought-provoking. And when you talked about pointing things out, Sindor, and how this relates to storytelling, it really makes me think about when I'm trying to write a dynamic dog report for someone, which is looking at pain, I have to tell a story. It's not just gathering the photo and video evidence. And that's probably some of the lesser important part of that, because if I don't have a story to present to a vet, I know what happens. They're like, who are you? You don't have any authority. Yeah. So it is really wrapped up in telling stories. And there were a million other thoughts, but I can't remember them right now. So
Yes.
I feel kind of overwhelmed by all of this new information. And I am one who is seeking some kind of validation or authority, but this just can shift me so far out of that. I really love it and appreciate it.
What you point out is kind of the last set of things that I have put down here, which is give up authority and a sense of control. You know, with stories, you have to be collaborative. But stories can't go certain places. Stories can't go where power is appreciated. Only numbers can go where power is appreciated. So I think stories can inspire numbers. So I think we can tell the stories so that they can tell the stories to those who can maybe produce numbers. And then you have to have a little bit of sarasara, right? Whatever will happen, will happen. I tell my bit and leave the rest to the universe. Kind of a thing.